So this is part 3 of a 3-part, and we're going to be talking about the transition to emergent symbolic communication. So basically, as you look at the communication matrix, we're talking level 5 or level 6, possibly level 7, but pretty much level 5 and 6. Before we go ahead, why don't you think about what we've talked about in the last couple weeks and let me know if you have any questions about that or any comments or thoughts as it relates perhaps to one of your students. I'll wait for a couple minutes and see what you can come up with, if anything. Okay. All right. So at this point, we're talking about that transition from pre-symbolic to symbolic communication. And my question for you is, what is perhaps the difference between concrete or abstract communication?
Philip, would you mind repeating the question, please?
Sure. We're transitioning into early symbolic communication, and level 5 talks about concrete symbolic communication, and level 6 refers to symbolic communication as abstract. And so my question is, what do you see as the difference between those two levels? What is concrete referred to and what is abstract referred to when it comes to symbolic communication?
Not sure if this is correct, but abstract may relate to the ability to understand and manipulate information that is more complex.
Well, I think the type of symbol is probably more complex. So you're partially right there. I think concrete symbols refer to those symbols, such as pictures or line drawings or even parts of objects, that share some feature in common with the thing that they stand for. And that shared feature is from the learner's perspective, okay? Abstract symbols, on the other hand, would be those types of symbols like words or signs or printed word, speech, where the symbol really doesn't have any relationship to the thing that it stands for. Its connection is totally artificial, abstract, if you will.
Here's a couple more comments.
Sure.
Concrete is using items or pictures, not drawings. Abstract is moving to words or drawing.
Okay. By drawing, are you referring to the individual doing the drawing, or drawings as in line drawing, board maker, that type of thing?
And another comment here, concrete is real life and abstract is not real? Question mark.
Yeah, not real. You bet. Again, the simplest way to think about the difference is, again, the relationship between the symbol and the thing that it stands for. In a concrete symbol, the relationship is one of shared features. So a picture may have the outline of, may be an actual photo of the thing that you're referring to, the referent. The line drawing will have some shared feature, whether it's the outline or a color or probably both. Parts of an object, again, will have shared features. The more it's possible to have, for example, a miniature of an object which might have more shared features, although for a visually impaired learner, miniatures are generally not desirable. Abstract, again, words, sign language, share nothing in common with the thing that they stand for. So their relationship is abstract. Does that help? Hopefully, as we move forward, we'll clarify this a little bit further. Okay.
And the response to your question about drawing, she says, maybe a little of both.
I see. Okay. All right. Well, let's move ahead. And again, as you guys have questions, don't hesitate to ask. I apologize for the time that we may be spending waiting, but I think it's the interaction that helps ensure that you're getting something out of this. All right. So at this juncture, what we know about our learner is that he is demonstrating that intent to communicate. He directs his behavior to a receiver with an identifiable message, okay? Levels 5, 6, or 7, if we're talking about symbolic communication, suggests that at this point, the learner is now beginning to be able to do that using some form of symbol, whether concrete or abstract, okay? So for goals or objectives for students at this level, consider the following. Increase the students, the sender's initiations and responses to interactions with the receiver, to make requests or choices and reinstate desired topics from symbol arrays. Combine symbolic means to expand the mean length of utterance, putting symbols together, okay, to form more complete sentences. Move to more abstract types of symbols. Perhaps our learner will begin his journey into symbolic communication at using a more concrete type of symbol, but he may progress beyond that to using more traditional, conventional forms of abstract symbolic communication. And I will say this too. There is no data that would suggest, no research that would suggest, because we begin with a more concrete type of symbol, it will preclude or inhibit or somehow prevent our learner from making that transition to more conventional abstract forms. In fact, I would suggest that the data is almost to the contrary, suggesting that we begin to use a type of symbol that is meaningful to that learner, and it has a facilitating effect on that learner's future potential use of more abstract forms. Okay. All right. What we're asking of our learner at this point is no small thing. Deloche talks about the development of representational behavior, the ability to recognize that something can stand for something else. Representational insight, the recognition of some type of relationship between a symbol and its referent, though not necessarily a symbolic one at the very beginning. Then dual representation, marking the child's movement into true symbolic behavior. It's the ability to see the picture as an object as well as it's standing for a referent. And then finally, symbolic sensitivity, a general readiness to look for symbolic relationships between other pictures and reference. And I would expand the word here from pictures to include object symbols as well. We have seen that. And to that last point, that symbolic sensitivity, we have called fast mapping, and we'll cover that as we move forward here. Okay. For those of you that are not familiar with tangible symbol systems, I would just give you this website. It's the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Special Education, osepideasthatwork.org. You get to that website, type in tangible symbol systems, and you can download this entire book free of charge. And the book talks specifically about the use of concrete symbolic communication. Okay? Just for your reference. So as you look at the communication matrix profile, we're talking specifically about level 5 or 6. And I think for the most part of today, we will be talking primarily about a level 5, the concrete symbolic communication. Okay. As you think about expressive communication development, this stage of concrete symbolic communication generally is not going to appear in most models of expressive communication development. Generally, our learners make that transition, or typically developing children will make that transition from pre-symbolic to emergent symbolic communication. First words, first spoken words, first signs. What we discovered in our research was that for many of our learners, although they had the intent to communicate, although they were solid at that level 3, level 4 stage of pre-symbolic communication, they were struggling to make that transition into symbolic communication. And so we investigated the use of a concrete symbolic system as a potential bridge into the use of symbols to communicate in general. The idea being that if that child could more readily detect the relationship between the symbol and the thing that it stood for, the referent, that it might be easier for them to begin to grasp the idea that this symbol, this thing in my hand, can stand for and therefore can be used to talk about or refer to these things in my world. Does that make sense? I hope so. What we discovered in our research too was that for many of our learners, it did in fact serve as that bridge, as some way to get our learners into the process of symbolic communication. And they did in fact move beyond concrete symbols to more abstract forms. Other of our learners, however, did not make the transition beyond concrete symbols. Instead, developed a rather sophisticated and multi-symbol system using concrete symbols as an alternative form of augmentative communication. Either way, it provided them a means to be able to begin to communicate about things in their world without having to be in the presence of those things or have those things occurring at this time, allowing them that decontextualization that symbolic communication provides us. Okay? Tangible symbols, specifically tangible symbols, mean these two things. They are physically tangible. They can be manipulated, they can be observed visually, but more importantly, they are conceptually tangible to the individual user. What that means is very, very important. It means that those symbols are designed from the perspective of the child. Okay? That's why we never created a set of tangible symbols. That would be counter to this notion that they are selected, they are developed from the perspective and the experience of the learner and not from our experiences or our perception of how those things should be represented. Tangible symbols include both 2- and 3-dimensional symbols created to suit the sensory and cognitive abilities as well as the experiences of the individual user.
We were 8.5 hours away from home visiting a friend, and Louis got out of the car and he looked around at his environment, and then he went and got his book. He was getting a little edgy, but he went and got his communication book, and he comes trundling up, and he tapped the picture of the dog, which we have a dog at home, and then he tapped a picture of his rocking horse, which is at home. And then he got my hand and led me to the car. And it was extremely clear that he was telling me he wanted to go home. And he was homesick or he just wanted to be there. And for him to communicate that clearly and to have the permanence of home, distance away, that was a real milestone.
We all need to communicate in order to lead a life of dignity. By communicating our needs, desires, and preferences to others, we are able to exercise control over our own existence. There are several different ways to communicate. Most people communicate through spoken and written words. Some people use alternative systems, such as sign language, braille, or high-tech electronic devices. These systems all require an understanding of an abstract symbol system consisting of arbitrary sounds or characters. Unfortunately, many people are unable to use these more familiar and abstract avenues of communication. Tangible symbol systems were designed for people who are not able to understand the meaning of the abstract symbols used in formal language systems.
I'll help clarify a little bit what we're going to be talking about. So once again, tangible symbols are iconic. They have a clear perceptual relationship to the thing that they stand for. And most importantly, that relationship, that is from the perspective and the experience of the user. They're permanent, requiring lower demands. If you have a display of symbols in front of you constantly, whether they're pictures or parts of objects, you're not having to recall those symbols from memory. They're right there in front of you. And so our learner is being tasked with using recognition rather than recall memory. Much easier, much more simple. Manipulable. They can physically be acted on, okay? Potentially making that communicative exchange literal, such as picking up and handing you the symbol. And they require simple motor responses. I should point out here that not every child that we work with significant disabilities is going to be able to physically pick up and hand you the symbol. And that should not exclude them from access to a meaningful symbolic form of communication. In other words, there are other strategies that we should consider. And those strategies should include some clear evidence that they're directing this behavior to us, as well as some way for them to indicate, whether it's through eye pointing, touching, body orientation, or whatever it might be, the symbol that they want to refer to. And for some of our learners with significant visual impairments, most obviously, they are tactually discriminable. Okay? Just to give you an idea of what might fall into that category that we refer to as tangible symbols, you can look at this list here. Okay, we go from identical objects all the way down to line drawings, generic line drawings, okay, commercially available line drawings. This isn't to suggest that you start at identical objects and work your way down, but it is instead to suggest to you that there are a whole variety of options for you to consider for your learner, okay? What changes from that top identical objects down to line drawings are the number of shared features that symbol has in common with the thing that it stands for, okay? So someplace within this list, there is the possibility that your learner will have some beginning way to begin to learn about communicating using symbols, right? So, for example, a roll of toilet paper, guess what that stands for? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Or a hook used to hang up your coat might be used to refer to arrival or departure in that child's daily schedule. Looking at this cup here, you can see different ways that that particular cup might be represented tactually. Again, as you move left to right, you can see that the size of the symbol is decreasing. Therefore, the amount of shared information that symbol has in common with the referent is also decreasing, moving towards a more abstract form. Okay. And then in some instances, we might do something like this, which we would call an artificial association, where we actually assign a symbol for a particular, in this case, place, location within the school. That child is given an identical symbol to use to refer to that. And when he travels there or she travels there, then she can match that symbol in her hand to the one affixed, in this case, to the door. Okay. I think somebody's microphone is on. I'm hearing page turning and whatnot, which is great. I don't mind, but just pointing that out. And then you also see here arrays of photographs, colored line drawings, and black and white line drawings. Okay. All of those fall within the description of and that continuum of what we refer to as tangible symbols. Again, what is significant here is that a selected symbol has some shared feature in common with the thing that it stands for from the perspective and the experience of the child, the user. All right? Any questions so far? Does that help clarify what we're talking about when we refer to concrete symbols?
We have a yes.
Good.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right. Please, if you do have questions as we move along, don't hesitate to ask those questions, either raising your hand or typing something in. Tessa is great at sharing that with us all so that we can make sure that this information is making sense to you and hopefully has some relevance for you. Who needs tangible symbols? Well, as we said earlier, when we're talking about expressive communication, we're suggesting that transition from pre-symbolic to symbolic communication is driven by the emergence of our learners' intent to communicate. Okay. Not only do they have that intent to communicate, but they have some intentional behavior that they can use to indicate or select the symbol that they want to refer to. And in general, we wouldn't suggest that a learner develop a concrete symbolic system if he's fluent and capable of using an abstract symbol type. I would say in general that's the case, but I can also think of a number of exceptions to that. For example, our learners who perhaps are fluent signers but go into the community and interact with people there who may not know sign language and they do not have an interpreter with them. Perhaps in that instance, they may use a backup system to augment their communication, and that system may consist of pictures, for example, just as an example. Okay. So we're not talking about a specific type of learner or a learner who presents with a particular disability or challenge. As you can as you look at this list here, the students that participated in our study around the use of tangible symbols were pretty diverse. You know, the vast majority of them had a significant developmental delay, okay? A number of them had a visual impairment, but not all of them did, okay? A number of them had significant orthopedic impairments, but not all of them did. 22% of the students, and we're talking about an N of approximately 42 students, 22% of them had a diagnosis of autism, okay, and so on and so forth. The mean number of handicapping conditions for the participants was 3. All right. All of these children, ranging in age from probably 4 to 18, were referred to our project for participation. We did not go out and seek them out. Instead, they were referred either by their classroom teacher, their speech language pathologist, and in some cases by the parents. All right. Okay. When we talk about tangible symbol systems, level 5, concrete symbols, we're talking about these 5 very, very important elements to consider. One is readiness. And I want to be real clear here. I'm not talking about readiness to communicate, okay? I think all of our learners, as we've talked about for the last couple weeks, as we consider the 7 levels of the matrix, all of our learners have the capacity to communicate. They are ready to communicate in some form, okay? What we're talking about here when we refer to readiness is that readiness to use a symbolic communication. In other words, that they have the intent to communicate. I'll explain a little bit more about why we feel that way in just a few minutes. Motivation. Motivation doesn't change, whether we're talking pre-symbolic or symbolic communication. Motivation is a driver. Motivation to engage another person, motivation to gather information or to gain access to things that they want or need, you bet. Extremely important. Okay. Indicating response. How will our learner use this symbol to engage you? Clearly, when we're talking about children with significant and multiple disabilities, one strategy will not work for them all, okay? Is that a problem? No, it's not a problem unless you're locked into that notion that everybody has to pick up and hand you something in order to use symbols to communicate, because that's going to exclude a lot of kids, right? Instead, we have to find a way that they are capable of acting on that symbol and also engaging us. And we'll look at several examples of what that might look like. Comprehension, the 4th element here, refers to building in strategies within your instruction that guarantee you that the learner knows what the symbol stands for. All right? We don't want to continue our instruction if our learner is simply going through the motions of pointing to, picking up and handing you, looking at, without ever asking the question, does he really understand what it is that he's handing me? What it is, does he understand what it is that he's looking at, okay? Or is he simply performing a motor response? And finally, promoting progress. Just because our learner begins to acquire some symbols doesn't mean we're done. Doesn't mean we can go on a break, right? It means that there's a next step. And we'll suggest several steps to consider as we move forward and continue to promote their progress. All right? It may be possible to teach someone to use a more abstract type of symbol through repeated practice, but the task is far easier if the learner understands the representation inherent in the symbol. That really does describe our rationale behind the inclusion of level 5 in the communication matrix. Making that transition from pre-symbolic to symbolic communication is a big, big deal. And we're going to make it easier for some of our learners if they can more readily understand how this thing, this symbol in their hand, stands for or relates to the thing that they want to talk about. Right? The use of pictures evolves to the point of being automatic in adults, yet the developmental process that results in such automatic recognition is remarkably complex and vulnerable to disruption from a variety of factors. Wow. It's not just a given, is what they're saying. It takes a long time. It's a process that our learners go through, or even our typically developing children go through, to recognize the use of these pictures as potential symbols for or representations of things in their environment. Okay. Motivation. Well, you know what? I want to back up a little bit, if you don't mind, because I thought I had a slide in here referring a little bit more detail about readiness. What we discovered in our research was that our learners who made the greatest progress during the course of the study were those learners who had the most solid base in terms of communicative intent. In other words, those learners who are operating at level 3 and level 4. Those learners who made the least progress, or who in fact did not acquire any symbols during the course of the study, were those learners who are operating at the earlier levels of expressive communication development, i.e. level 1 and level 2. Okay, that's why we talk about readiness as being an important consideration. Okay, does your learner have a solid base? Is he ready to make that transition? Does he understand his role in communication? Does he understand the necessity of a communication partner? Does he have things to communicate about? Okay, all of those are questions that need to be answered, particularly as you're considering whether or not this child is ready to move into symbolic forms of communication. Motivation, okay? Obviously, the more motivated the learner is by the topic, the more likely he is going to want to communicate about it. Those topics, those contexts for instruction, the ones that are best suited are those that will happen regularly and will happen frequently to ensure that our learner gets sufficient practice in learning to use symbols to communicate. Okay. What we discovered in some of our work too was that while it's nice, while it's important for functional communication development to embed these opportunities throughout the day when they would naturally occur, it may not provide sufficient practice for our learners to acquire symbolic communication. Therefore, it may be necessary to augment those naturally occurring opportunities with more deliberate and intensified practice sessions, okay? This is just a very, very simple example of how we might go about assessing preference for our learner in terms of things that he may want to communicate about. As you look at this, can you see, are these images blocking that? Are you able to see the slide clearly enough? Okay, all right. As you look at this list here, we were presenting this learner 2 different objects from the list on the far left at a time, okay? In that very first trial, we presented him Mickey Mouse and this stuff called GAC, okay? He chose Mickey Mouse, and we can see that as indicated by that backslash on forming the X there, okay? Mickey Mouse was presented several more times over the course of the next 2 days. Looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times, and he chose it, as I'm looking at this data here, 3 out of 5 times. Okay, I would like to move these. Can't Can't find my cursor, I apologize. Oops. All right. GAC was presented a number of times, looks like almost 8 times, and he only chose it once. Okay. Spacetops was presented a number of times, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times, and he chose it 4 out of 5 times. Just from that data alone, which do you think would be more preferred based on his responses, GAC or spacetops?
Spacetops.
Absolutely, yeah. And this is a very, very simple, very straightforward way of assessing preference. Again, there may be, well, there are, in fact, a number of different ways to do that, but what's important here is that we have a good sense of the sorts of things that our learner might want to communicate about as a way to begin to introduce the idea of symbols standing for these preferred items. All right? Indicating response. How will the individual indicate or select a symbol? As I mentioned already, picking up and giving is great. It serves not only to establish the topic, but to also engage a communication partner, doesn't it? But not all of our learners, as you know, are perhaps able to, or in some cases, willing to do that. I had a learner who refused to give up his pictures. He saw those as his pictures. So instead, he chose to approach you with his communication book, hold up his book, and touch the picture that he wanted to refer to with his thumb, okay? It worked just as well, didn't it? We would have had a lot of difficulty had we insisted that he do it just this one way. Okay. Our criteria is that however that learner does it, it must also ensure that they have gained your attention. Simply pointing to a picture, simply looking at a picture, simply picking up a picture without engaging another person isn't communication. Because that learner has not included or directed that behavior to somebody. He needs somebody to receive this information from him, doesn't he? So does the indicating response you have targeted include a means for the child to gain your attention? If not, consider how the child will do this. Will he touch you? Will he vocalize? Will he approach you? Will he raise his hand? Will he activate a switch to call you to him or to gain your attention? Okay? Let's look at several different examples of how these learners use their symbols to engage another person. Oh, you want some water? How's it, Graham? You haven't eaten yet?
some more bread? Are those good grandparents we're trying? Oh, you're raking them. Raking them. Check it out. Bread, okay, I'm gonna get you so fast. Good job, Jordan. Yeah, where did you go, buddy? Wait. All right, there's one more. Dump it on your plate.
So how did Jordan act on his symbols and act on his communication partner?
He pulled a physical item off his communication board to give to his partner.
All right. So he physically scanned the symbols on his board, chose the one that he wanted, and handed it to his communication partner. Okay.
Yeah, we have a few more comments and a question.
Sure.
The question is, what was the purpose of the green square on the right?
All right. The green square on his left was I want, and the one on the far right was finished. And so it was our attempt to begin to expand the mean length of utterance, as well as introduce some more abstract forms. So both of those symbols were represented in the Braille text. Okay. The other symbols are thermoform, partial representations of the things that they stand for. So they are concrete symbols, but they have a very reduced amount of tactile information for him.
She says, thank you.
You bet.
And a few more comments here. He was selecting the symbol for what he wanted and handing it to his communication partner.
Okay.
I take it from the partner directing Jordan's hand to the green switch that this was the motion that was to gain the partner's attention, and by taking a symbol off his communication board.
Right. All right. Yep. So, and again, as I explained, attempting to begin to expand the mean length of utterance by adding to his requests the I want portion. Okay. And then picking up the symbol for the thing that he wanted and handing it to his partner. All right. Great. Here's another one for you.
Want the puppet or the bumble ball? You want the bumble ball? You want that bumble ball? What'd you pick? Yes, you picked the bumble ball. Good girl. Now you're getting with it. Now that's more like the Katie I know. No, Billy, you need to go play.
All right. How did Katie make her selection there? And could you tell how she engaged her partner?
Eye gaze.
Yep. Good. Any thoughts about how she engaged her partner?
Smiling at her, I think.
And vocalizing. Yep. Very good. It took us approximately 3 months of intervention to determine whether or not Katie was capable of using her eye gaze and alternating her gaze across the items in the array to indicate an object and then eventually to indicate a symbol that corresponded to that object. Making sure that these behaviors that we were asking for of her were not only doable for her, but detectable for us. All right. So you can see in this example, Katie is pretty much set up so that all she really has to contend with at this point is the shifting of her visual attention, moving her head laterally and moving her vision side to side. Okay. So we have provided her a semi-supine position with plenty of trunk control, some good head control, abduction of the hips, and flexion. Because when Katie got excited, boy, she would extend and get very, very stiff. Okay, so abduction and flexion there, giving her as much support as we possibly could so that we could really isolate the behavior that we believed was the most doable for her and detectable for us. Okay, as you can tell, looking at this, Katie at this point was not capable of picking up and handing us the symbol for the things she wanted to talk about. And it is not appropriate that she be excluded from the opportunity to make that transition into symbolic communication simply because of that. All right. And here's another child, in this case, using symbols for drink and eat. And these symbols are affixed to switches. So activation of a switch with the drink symbol on it would say, I want a drink. The auditory would serve to alert the attention of another person, and the object symbol would indicate what it is that they're talking about, and so on. Okay, so a variety of different ways for our learners to be able to access a tangible symbol and use it to engage another person. Okay, no one size fits all, does it? Okay, comprehension. Comprehension refers to how do you know that that child knows what that symbol stands for? When the child indicates a symbol, he should also be asked to show or to indicate what the symbol means. What we're looking for there clearly is one-to-one correspondence. I'd suggest that we use random placement of the objects and symbols to avoid creating a position bias. And by that I mean making sure that for the most part, the symbol is not on the same side as the referent that we're asking the child to refer to, okay? But we're randomizing, or the symbol, the correct symbol or the correct referent is not always to the child's right or always to the child's left. All right, so random placement. Okay, so here's a couple examples of a comprehension check. Sammy is still figuring out how to use these symbols, and what these symbols mean. So we are requiring at this point a comprehension check.
Can't talk if you don't like this dinosaur today. Whoa, whoa. What do you want? Do you want Hippie? Okay. Down, down. Show me Hippie. Is it this one, or this one, Sammy? Look. Good job, Sam. That's a good boy. Uh-oh. Let me fix.
Okay. So after all that, battery's dead. Okay. So what did the comprehension check look like? What did Sammy have to do? How were we assessing his comprehension?
He chose the physical item and then was able to choose the corresponding picture.
Very good. That's it.
Choose the
Oh.
item, then choose a symbol out of 3 choices, indicating the correct picture of what he wanted. Choose the item and then choose the symbol.
Okay. Good. Object first and then symbol. I mean, you could flip it around. You could do symbol first and then object, but the point here is that when he picks the symbol or he picks the object, we have to make sure that he understands what that stands for, okay? Okay, so it's not simply a matter of what you choose is what you get. Right. We're not going to require this all the time. We're collecting data on the comprehension. Once the data indicates that that child clearly understands what that symbol stands for, we'll drop that comprehension check requirement. I might use that, though, if, for example, I move from a 3-symbol array to a 6-symbol array. I have just doubled the visual and cognitive demands on Sam, haven't I? Moving from a 3 to a 6-symbol array. And so I might reinsert, I'm not saying I might, I will reinsert the comprehension check at that point to make sure that I haven't exceeded what he's capable of discriminating between visually or cognitively at this point, okay? Hope that makes sense. Assuming that a student understands a symbol when he doesn't isn't doing him any favors. As long as you make this faulty assumption, you are depriving the student of appropriate communication instruction. You are also teaching the student that it doesn't make any difference what symbols he indicates.
Philip, can I interrupt with a comment question from
Please.
someone here?
Please.
On the previous video, after the girl chose the item, her partner asked her to choose a card. Is this to begin moving her to symbolic or working on comprehension?
We're talking about Katie? Little girl laying down?
Yes.
Yeah. Those cards were photographs. They were photographs of the things of the different toy items that you had been offered. Okay. So yes, we were moving towards symbolic communication there. Those photographs would make up her symbolic communication system. And in that example, she was demonstrating the comprehension check, choosing the bumble ball from an array of 2, and then presented an array of 2 symbols. She had to choose the symbol that corresponded to the object that she chose by looking at it. Okay, that makes sense?
Yeah, she says thank you.
You bet. You bet. Comprehension check provides an objective measure upon which to base your decisions. It gives you sound documentation of your efforts to tailor a communication system to the individual user. and can be used to explain to parents and professionals why you made the decisions you did. And I think documentation is always good. When the data clearly indicates that the child understands what the symbol stands for, then it may no longer be necessary to require a comprehension check. Here, Tony will show you.
Tony is deaf and blind. His teacher is rearranging the snack choices on his tray, and when Tony gains her attention, she shows him tactually what the choices are: pretzels, pop, and raisins. Tony searches in his book of thermoform symbols, looking for the symbol for what he wants. In this case, he wants some pretzels, so he hands that symbol to his teacher, and she gives him some. Then the teacher rearranges the symbols in Tony's book. He will have to look carefully for the right symbol next time. When Tony indicates that he wants more, his teacher guides his hand back to his book. He looks for the symbol that he needs, this time in a new location, and he hands it to his teacher, and she gives him more pretzels. Now the choices are down to 2, so the teacher shows Tony tactually. The pop and raisins are still options, but there are no more pretzels.
I apologize, our video seemed to freeze up there. But in Tony's case, you can see that he had a very, very extensive vocabulary by this time, and we were no longer requiring the comprehension check. We had ample data, ample evidence that indicated that Tony knew what his symbols stood for. In fact, Tony, when he graduated high school, had in that book 181 three-dimensional tangible symbols that he used to communicate throughout his day. Okay. The downside of a comprehension check, I get it. There's always a downside, right? Comprehension check delays the provision of natural reinforcement for communicating, right? Because the child essentially is being asked to make 2 responses before he gets what it is that he's requesting. But I got to tell you, in all the years that I required the comprehension check in my instruction using symbols, I never once had a child get up and leave or shut down because I was requiring him to make 2 responses before he got what he wanted. And the reason for that probably has a lot to do with the fact that what we were talking about were things that were very motivating to the learner, okay? So it was worth his while. Comprehension check is one more thing to keep track of and take data on. Well, I'm sorry, but I have no problem with data-driven instruction, okay? Like we said earlier, I don't want to make some assumptions about the fact that simply because the learner is picking up a symbol and handing it to me or pointing to a symbol, that he understands what that symbol means, okay? If I make that assumption and it turns out that I'm wrong, that all I've taught this learner to do is to pick up and hand me something or to look at something, then I have not done him any favors at all. In fact, I have wasted his time, okay? I want to make sure that he knows, that I know that he knows, okay? A comprehension check may show you that the student doesn't understand his symbols, and everyone was happier when they assumed that he did. Well, that last one is a little tongue-in-cheek, but yeah, I've met a few people who actually felt that way. All right. Are there any questions about the comprehension check process?
We do have a question here. Are we looking for a 100% when asking him to choose again?
That's a pretty steep criteria. My criteria actually, has usually been 80% accuracy across 2 consecutive sessions, okay? I'm going to look at my data, though, and look for patterns in the data. So, for example, if a learner is missing the first out of 10 trials, just use that as an example. If the learner is missing the first 3 and then getting the next 7, and that pattern generally follows day to day, what can you surmise about that learner at that point in time? What does that data suggest to you?
She responded, yes, I have a student that is very difficult to tell whether he is really able to communicate effectively.
Using symbols or in general?
In general, but with symbols mostly.
So are you requiring a comprehension check right now?
Most of the time.
Most of the time, okay. So what are your options? What's your data suggesting to you? Is there a pattern in the data? So back to my original question. This is the first 3 or 2, and then gets the next 7 or 8, day after day. What is that telling you?
That he has lost interest.
Well, he's missing the first 3 and then getting the next 7. Sounds like his interest is kind of picking up a little bit. What it suggests to me is that he's learning from the correction procedure, that he is not retaining the information from one day to the next. So he's learning as he makes those mistakes and is corrected. He's figuring out what it is that he's supposed to do. Now, a learner that has lost interest, his data is going to look a little bit different, I would think. I would think it would almost be just the opposite, that we'd see the first 5 or 6 correct, and then perhaps the next 3 or 4 incorrect. And I've actually seen that several times.
She says, sorry, I heard that in reverse. And another comment, maybe it takes time to warm up to the communication.
Yeah, all of that, all of the above, all of the possibilities, But because you're taking that data, looking at that child's comprehension, looking at the accuracy of his responses, you're beginning to be able to dissect the possible reasons for their struggle. One learner, for example, was getting first 7 correct, and the last 3 he just tanked, okay? What we did was shorten the session. We shortened the number of trials from 10 to 6, okay? And created a much more lag time between the trials to increase his interest in the task, okay? So if he got one wrong, then the consequence was not only the correction procedure, but there was a delay of approximately 30 seconds to a minute before we would offer him the next opportunity, making it a little bit more important that he pay attention, that he really focus on the task at hand, if he in fact wanted to make a request for something that we had offered. All right. How do you help the child to keep learning? Okay. So the last of those 4 or 5 elements that we spoke about earlier was promoting progress. Okay. I guess my first priority would be to expand the vocabulary. Okay. Once we begin to get a sense from our data that this type of symbol makes sense to the learner and that he's able to make the connection between the symbol and the referent and use it as a way to gain access to things that he wants, to talk about things that he wants to talk about, then we're going to continue to build vocabulary, which is going to require us to continue to assess their preferences and motivations for communication, isn't it? okay? Continue to build vocabulary using the current type of symbol because we know it works, okay? I'm going to look at whether or not we can increase the size of the symbol array. If I can present him 3 or 4 symbols at a time, that's going to be a much more efficient system than a system that only allows him an array of 2, isn't it? And by extension, an array of 6 symbols is going to be a lot more efficient than a symbol system that presents only 2 or 4 at a time. Yeah? Okay. But as we mentioned earlier, increasing the size of a symbol array is going to increase the demands on that learner, visually as well as cognitively. Because the more information you present to the learner at one time, the greater the likelihood that some of those symbols or some of those reference will share features in common, okay? There may be 2 symbols in there that have a touch of green to them or that feel somewhat similarly, okay? And so you are increasing the demands on that learner for his ability to discriminate, right? Generalize the use of symbols to other situations and with other people. You don't want to be the only communication partner for this learner, do you? And you don't want that learner to only be able to communicate using symbols during snack time. All right? So we're going to want to provide them access, provide them symbols, and provide them opportunities to use these symbols across a variety of different situations with a variety of communication partners. Teach new communicative functions, right? All right. It's one thing to say, I want my learner to be able to label or to comment or to answer questions. It's another thing to make sure that you're providing opportunities for them to develop those skills, all right? If they're never given the opportunity to label or comment or to direct attention, then why on earth would we expect them to develop that communicative function or intent? Okay. Multi-symbol utterances. Begin to string symbols together to form more complete thoughts, all right? Put symbols together in some manner that allows for their portability. Because it stands to reason that the more portable a system, the more accessible it's going to be, ideally. And if it's accessible, then we've increased the likelihood that that learner will use it, yeah? Okay. And finally, change symbol type. Okay, I know a lot of folks are inclined to move that last bullet there, that change symbol type, up to the top of the list or near the top of the list. We're anxious to get them to move towards more conventional abstract forms of symbolic communication. And certainly, you know, if you're getting indications from that learner during your instruction that he is able to do that, by all means, probe it. Check it out. You've got a strategy now. You've got a data collection means now to assess whether or not you're right, whether or not that learner is able to use a more abstract form. But if he's not, your priority goes back to expanding the vocabulary at the level of representation that you know he knows right now. Okay. Let me back up. Well, here's an example of a system that needed some help. This system was limiting, not because of the learner, but because of what we were able to put together for him so that we could read his responses and present him information that he could handle, okay? So as you see here, this learner has an array presented in a vertical fashion to his right side, okay? The reason for this is this learner would experience severe spasms many times throughout the day. His body would lock to his right side, okay, such that he could not move his head or the rest of his body from that right side, okay? So they developed a communication system that really would work even during those moments of spasm, okay, for him, okay? And this learner was not using his lower visual fields as readily as his upper visual fields. So they were less accessible to him. So as you see here, the teacher is pointing to each of the items in the array, labeling them. He is scanning each one, okay? And then he'll fix his gaze on the one that he wants and vocalize, okay? Well, that's a pretty limiting system. So one day, we're playing with this guy and discover that even in the midst of those severe motor spasms, he was able to move his chin, move his jaw, and activate, in this case, activate a switch. So with some duct tape and tongue depressors, we mounted a switch beneath his chin, and he was able to repeatedly activate that switch, in this case, to get that vibration, okay, to activate the vibration, okay. But you can see a few problems design-wise with this idea, right? Particularly covering the eyes for a visually impaired kid who uses eye gaze as his strategy for accessing his systems, his symbols. So we devised this little more sophisticated way. And now, with this adaptation, this learner is able to not only engage in a variety of different leisure activities, activating the lights in this light room by himself, but more importantly, he's able to activate and access a much more expanded communication system array. For example, here, he is now scrolling through basically a PowerPoint at this point, a PowerPoint presentation of all the things that he wants to talk about, okay? Or might want to talk about. And again, he will scroll through that, activating the switch beneath his chin by moving his jaw until it lands on the picture for the thing that he wants. And then again, he will vocalize, okay? And get a mouthful, in this case, of the yogurt that he was excited about getting, okay? Eventually, this youngster learned to use this system to activate a communication device that would allow him to scan through an array of a variety of different symbols, and he would activate it in the same way or access it in the same way, okay? Increasing his access to a much broader, much wider array of symbols, okay? So back to that earlier point about changing symbol type or moving towards a more abstract type of symbol too soon. What we know from our research and from research of others is that as the learner begins to acquire vocabulary at a certain level of symbolic representation, new vocabulary may be learned at a faster rate. This is called fast mapping, right? We saw it over and over and over again. And the literature describes this phenomena, if you will, for many different scenarios. Learners using pictures, learners using speech, learners using sign, whatever. That acquisition of the first vocabulary may require an extended period of time, but as we progress, that learner is now learning new vocabulary at that same level of representation in a much faster rate, again, called fast mapping. Well, if we move the learner to a more abstract level too soon, rather than allowing them the time to develop a meaningful vocabulary at the current level, this may preclude that fast mapping experience. Which is basically that notion that, well, if this stands for this, then I wonder what this stands for. Then this stands for this, and this stands for this. And that acquisition, that discovery of one-to-one correspondence between the symbols and the reference they represent happens much more readily. And so, as I talk about my learners who've acquired the use of symbols to communicate, I now will not only share the size of their vocabulary and the type of symbol that they're using, but I think equally, if not more important, is our ability to share how fast our learner is able to learn new vocabulary, to acquire new vocabulary. Because I'm sure I'm not the only person who has heard from teachers in new environments, new classrooms that my kids are transitioning to, that, well, you know what, this vocabulary is not really important here. We don't really talk about these things. We don't really do these sorts of things in this room, okay? And now what I'm able to say is, fine. What my learner is capable of doing, though, is learning any new vocabulary that is meaningful to him and presented in this manner, using this type of symbol, this fast. So, tell me that this vocabulary may not be relevant in your new classroom here, your new environment, but I'm telling you, you give him something that is meaningful to him, represented in this fashion, and he will learn it this fast. And so I think that is an important piece of information to be able to share about our learners, their capacity to fast map, okay? Here's a case study of a learner through approximately 6.5 months of his acquisition of tangible symbols, okay? Just to set this up, Alberto at this time is approximately 5.5 years old, or just about 5.5 years old, okay? He has a vision impairment, and he has a diagnosis of autism. He's in a preschool setting with approximately 21 children. It's a supported integrated setting. Okay, so there are children, approximately 60% of the learners in that classroom do not have a diagnosed disability. 40% do. Okay, so let's take a look.
Chips? Which one do you want? Put it away? What, this? Yeah, come away. Good boy. Nice sitting. Nice sitting, Albert. Nice looking. Can you give it to Darlene? There you go. Can you look at the picture on that? And the rest of your yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Let me interrupt just briefly here. I got to tell you, Alberto had, at age 5.5 years, had 2 spoken words that he used regularly. Put away. And you just heard him. So as this case study progresses here, listen for how his spoken vocabulary is growing along with his use of these tangible symbols. Also pay close attention to the type of symbol that he's using. For him, his system consisted of both a photograph and a small 3-dimensional portion of the thing that was represented in that photograph. because Alberto's tendency was to to touch first and then look. So by including that tactile piece to the symbol array, it would draw his visual attention to the symbol as well. All right, apologize for the interruption.
Yay, good boy. Let's play. What do you want? Put that away? You want this? Okay. Show me Hippie. Where's Hippie at? Where's Hippie at, Albert? There you go. Thank you. Give me a five. Yeah, you're smart, son. Okay. Ooh, I get a turn. Oh, Hippie. Oh. Sit on there. Good boy, Albert. Nice job. Sit down. You're gonna play. I know. What hurts? Your finger hurt? Sorry, finger hurts. How fun is it? Pen? Pen, hold on. You show me the picture. I know. Show me the picture. Pen. Yeah. That's it. Pen. It's smaller. Uh-oh. It broke, huh? That's okay. I'll fix it again. Give me 5. Good boy. Smart. Just smart. You swore. Yeah. Paper? Gotcha. Already have it here. How about it? Alright. All done? Okay, we're all done. Oh, you gonna play with that? Okay, you need to find it. Find it. Find it. Like it, Albert. Look. It's in there. You look. All right. Yes, good boy. Found it. Yes. All right. Got face off. Okay, I'll put it back on. Back on. Whoa, Albert. Huh? I don't know. You tell me. Is it? Is that the slide? What is that? Wait for Darlene. There you go. Good boy. Nice listening. Hold my hand.
All right. Any questions about what you saw about his system or about the strategies that we were employing there, or? Okay. So let me tell you, because he made such progress with his communication system, well, let me back up first. You saw that he was using a tangible symbol system that consisted both of three-dimensional and two-dimensional symbols. Okay. Periodically, we would probe his accuracy using those symbols if we eliminated the tactile component. Okay. Because we were collecting all of the data all along about his comprehension, we were able to monitor pretty regularly, pretty consistently, what would happen to his accuracy if we made such changes to his system. What we observed was that his accuracy dropped way off. That for whatever reason, Alberto needed that three-dimensional piece in conjunction with the two-dimensional piece. It's a unique system. It is not about one size fits all. Tangible Symbols talks about a variety of different levels of representation based on the notion of shared features, okay? So this particular strategy worked for Alberto, and that was really what we were most interested in at this point in time, okay? Because of the progress that he made in the course of that intervention, Alberto was selected to go to what was considered by most folks a less restrictive environment for the next school year. Unfortunately, the teacher in that classroom decided that any child using an augmentative system would use the same system. And just imagine what the odds are that that system would look anything like what Alberto needed. Any thoughts? You're right. Not very likely. And so, because Alberto's system was no longer available to him, what would you imagine about, or what do you think happened to Alberto?
A couple comments. The first one is that is very sad. His opportunity to contribute dropped off considerably, I'm sure.
Yep.
Of course it wasn't. How sad to take away the form of communication he knew and used well. It is very sad the system most likely didn't work and he regressed.
Yeah.
I'm thinking the system would be different. He would not communicate like he had in the past.
That's right. And so imagine what it's like for him now that he no longer has that means to express himself. And so what do you think he's going to use instead?
Behaviors.
Yep.
Tantrums.
And so, yes, all the above. Yep. Unfortunately, all brought on by this teacher's decision to eliminate the symbolic means of communication that he knew best and that he could use best. So, because of that, he was moved to a classroom that, again, most folks would consider more restrictive. But in retrospect, I considered it less restrictive because of the fact that this teacher said, boy, if this is the type of system he needs, he should have it, okay? And he developed and continued to use and expand that means of symbolic communication for the next couple of years. Interestingly, though, what was also developing was his spoken vocabulary. And so within 2.5 years, Alberto was no longer requiring the use of an augmentative system to support his growing speech, okay? His primary mode within 2.5 years was speech, right?
Here's a comment. It
Yeah.
is hard as a teacher to be proficient in all the systems out there.
Oh,
Although you have to try, you can't take a child's voice away.
yeah. It is hard. It is, it is absolutely hard. I get that. But as you point out so accurately, it's the alternative is not acceptable either, is it? To take the child's voice away.
Another comment, the problem I often find is that teachers do not communicate the needs of the students coming into their classroom, especially when they come from another district or state.
Yeah, yeah. The transfer of that information that you need to appropriately provide for that child and to meet his or her needs, yeah, is really dependent on how well we communicate and make sure that information goes forward and follows that child. I agree. Yeah. Unfortunately, in this particular instance, that was not the excuse. This was all within district. This was all, we were accessible. The previous teacher was accessible to this new teacher. But I don't want to dwell on that. But I totally agree with you. I totally agree with you. So, yeah, I mean, it's not an easy task. It's not a one that we can take for granted, but very, very important for our learners, for sure. For sure. So, at this point, that transition from pre-symbolic to symbolic communication, the means may be concrete, it may be abstract. The sender, ideally, is learning to begin to combine symbols to form more complete utterances according to the rules of grammar, moving into that final stage of level 7. That's the range that the communication matrix covers. So you obviously can see that this tool is not intended for all learners with significant disabilities. It certainly works for learners across a variety of ages, but those learners fall within that range of reflexive reactive stage all the way to emerging language. Beyond that, then we go to perhaps looking for more traditional, more standardized sorts of assessments that would be appropriate for our learners who are now operating at that level 7. Are there other questions about this concrete symbolic stage? If not, then since we have some time left, I thought maybe we could I could run a another case study for you guys to take a look at. This one is not captioned, however. I hope that is all right. Will that work for folks?
Look at your beautiful smile. Did you miss me? Did you miss me or something? Okay, here's the ball. Here's this pen. Do you want this one or do you want this one? Okay, show Heather. That's Betty, she's okay. You want the pen or the ball? Which one? Okay. Or do you just want to stand for a while?
Okay, what you could see there, that was the very beginning of Katie's intervention time. And you could see we were still trying to figure out what she was capable of doing. She was trying to figure out what it was that we wanted her to do. There's a lot going on there, a lot of learning taking place on both sides.
Okay, I have the folder and I have the mirror. What do you want? You want the mirror? Okay, here it is. Ready? You like that? You like that? He's talking to you. Show me the beans. I just love the mirror. You want some more, Katie? Okay, I'll put it away. Mirror's done. Oh, will I get that one too? Okay, Katie. I have folders and I have the hipper hug. What do you want?
Okay, so we're still not using symbols. We're still working on her developing that strategy for alternating, for shifting her gaze between two objects presented in an array, and then coming back and fixating her gaze or fixing her gaze on the thing that she wants. Making sure that she's understanding what it is that she has to do and that we can read the behavior, okay?
Want the puppet or the bumble ball? You want the bumble ball? You want that bumble ball? What did you pick? Yes, you picked the bumble ball. Good girl. Now you're getting with it. Now that's more like the Katie I know. Are you laughing or crying, or you don't know? Do you want the bubbles, the bumble ball, or the pen? What do you want? You want the bubbles? Yeah, you say you want the bubbles. So, what did you pick? The pen or the bubbles? Which one, Katie? You picked your bubbles, huh? You smart girl, you. Can I write that down and then we'll blow some bubbles, huh? Okay, here they come. Here they come. Whoa! Want more bubbles? Yeah. Oh, good bubbles. Oh, it's gonna land on you. There's gonna land on you. Oh no! Look at those bubbles on you. Get it.
Hopefully you guys have noticed how much faster now Katie is in her responses. scanning more readily, fixating her gaze on the thing that she wants more quickly. All of this is part of the learning process, learning what it is that she needs to do in order to communicate to another person.
I think you're right. She didn't smile. Do you want some more, Katie? See, she's not smiling. If she wanted more, she'd smile, wouldn't she? There you go. Okay, so let's hold it so she can look.
She says nothing.
At what?
In the middle.
Well, oh, I think she looked at something else. Katie, can you look at it again? Yeah. See, did you see what she was looking at? The bubbles, right? So hold the bubbles in this hand. Yes, she is. She looked at both of them first before she picked this one, though, huh, didn't she? That's nice. Now, let me get this set up for you. I'll just look at the bubbles for her. How's that? And then let me blow some for you.
I'm all done.
Good. Thanks so much, Ethan. It was really nice.
Hey, Philip, we have a question.
Yeah. Great.
How did you determine which items to start with? Did you just try a variety of items and see what her reaction to them were?
We conducted a pretty extensive preference probe with Katie, with all of the kids basically, but to assess what her interests were. And so those items that we got the strongest positive reactions to became part of her communication system, her initial vocabulary, if you will. So to answer your question, it's through a preference probing strategy.
What did she do with the folder?
The folder was a good question. The folder was a foil, okay? So we put that in there to do a couple of things. One, assess whether or not Katie was actually discriminating between the items in the array and whether or not we were able to read her responses accurately, okay? So it's basically, if you consider an array of a preferred and non-preferred, that's an easy task. All they have to do is essentially avoid the non-preferred item, okay? So it was a step in the process before we got to actually two familiar items. Does that make sense? Basically a blank card or a non-preferred or nothing.
Yes, thank you.
You bet. That last scene there, that little girl was one of Katie's classmates, okay? She had been essentially watching Katie and watching us work with Katie pretty much the entire school year, or for about the 7 months of the intervention, okay? In fact, we would observe this little one at different times within the classroom with Katie, interacting with Katie. There was one instance in particular that we observed, and she brought another classmate over and stood in front of Katie, in front of her wheelchair, and placed this other classmate to her left, and she herself stood to Katie's right. And then she said, "Which one of us do you want to play with, me or her?" And made Katie look at both and then fixate her gaze on the classmate that she wanted to play with. Okay, so this little one was ready to to learn Katie's communication system from the very beginning. In fact, this little classmate was one of the big reasons that Katie was able to transition the following school year into the regular kindergarten. The principal had observed the two of them interacting in this observed this little girl learning to use Katie's communication system with her, and was convinced by that Katie could successfully function in an integrated setting in the following school year. Okay.
Hey, Philip, I think we have time for just one more quick question.
You bet.
So Carol asks, what was the deciding factor to determine when she was ready to move on to the next level?
We knew that Katie had that intent to communicate. We had observed that, we had assessed that, we had interviewed other people familiar with Katie. So from the communication matrix standpoint, this was a child operating at level 3, okay, with the intent to communicate. She did not, and she was not a likely candidate to use or to develop a conventional gestural system. And so the next step in the progression or the development of her expressive communication is moving into symbolic communication. And so the determining factor was, in fact, the presence of her intent to communicate pre-symbolically. So the next step really became determining what type of symbol was most readily accessible to her. And there was no indication that speech or sign language or more other abstract forms were the next step. And so we began looking at concrete symbols as a possibility. Okay. Does that work?
So Phil.
Yeah. Hi, Robin.
A pause in the action there.
Yeah.
So I just want to, I don't know if you have any last words here.
Other than thank you very much, and I hope this was useful to you folks.
Yes, well, and thank you. This was just an elegant series, and on such an incredibly important topic. I want to thank you, of course, for doing this for these last 3 sessions. And as all of you know, if you've been with the ITC before, this will be archived for 2 years. So please, you can watch it again, tell other people about it. Just so many things that people are struggling to understand and don't have very much information on. So I'm just thrilled you did this for us. I really appreciate it. I want to thank all of you for joining us. Please complete the evaluation. It's really important for us. And I want to wish you all a great summer. And we'll look forward to seeing you again in the fall. So thank you and good evening.
Thank you, Robin.
Bye.